Up until quite recently, composers wrote music and performers played it. Very often the composers themselves were also performers, but they still needed a live performance to have their music heard. Now things have changed. Virtual instruments have become much more sophisticated, so that a composer who knows how to use them well can now do very convincing simulations. And sophisticated mixing techniques allow segments of one performance to be combined with segments of another, provided they're done in the same acoustic environment. But even today, a live performer still has a very important role to play. It's easier to simulate a full orchestral piece than, say, a piece for solo cello. This is because, over longer periods of time, the solo instrument needs much more variety, nuance, attack, vibrato, and so on, and the simulation usually ends up sounding somewhat impoverished compared to a real soloist. Even when the sound library allows for lots of nuance, the composer has to know how the given instrument will achieve it. Phrasing on the violin is not handled the same way as on the trombone. Only an experienced performer knows all the subtleties their instrument can provide. The fact that a great many composers of earlier times were also excellent performers had important effects on their compositions. And even the composers who were not themselves performers had to respect their performers, since they depended on them to play the new compositions. A former student of mine once had to play the piano part of another student's composition. It was fearsomely difficult, and he worked long and hard to master it. But then, when the other instruments were playing, the piano part was inaudible. This is an example of not respecting the performer. It doesn't bode well for that composer's future career. A composer who wrote music that was very difficult but not musically rewarding will not end up with many performers who really wanted to play their music. And of course, in an era without recordings, that meant that nobody would hear their music either. This kind of respect for performers is just as necessary in today's musical world, since the best performances still usually come from live performances by excellent musicians. Also remember that rehearsal time, especially for ensembles, is very expensive, so wasting the musician's time is to be avoided. The point here is not that a composer should never write difficult parts for the performers, but rather that the difficulty should be idiomatic for the instrument in question and realistic for their level of training, that the musical result should be enjoyable for the performer who eventually does master the difficulties. Another thing to be aware of: when you ask performers to do things that they haven't been trained to do, like for example asking violinists to sing while playing, usually the performers are reticent. If you really want somebody to sing most of the time, it's better to use trained singers, or at least a professional choir. I have nothing against novel special effects, but again, the effort should be musically worth it. This is an important reason why composers who are also serious performers have an important advantage. They understand that performers experience themselves in a deep, personal way. Another advantage of being a composer-performer is that you can form friendships and groups with other musicians and get to know their instruments better. For example, I learned a lot about string instruments as a young pianist because I often played chamber music with a violinist friend. Learned what was idiomatic, what was difficult, and why, and which passages sounded especially rich. It was an invaluable experience. And similar experiences with other instruments gave me an excellent start in learning orchestration. Remember, in music, practical experience counts much more than book learning. Composers who play orchestral instruments have another advantage. Since they've actually spent time in the orchestra, there are all kinds of things they know without being told. For example, about orchestral balance. They would never make certain beginner mistakes, like expecting a solo cello to be louder than a trombone in the same register. These realities of orchestral balance often don't even need to be mentioned to these composers, whereas somebody who has no orchestral experience doesn't automatically just know these things. In a deeper sense, when playing with other musicians in chamber music or orchestral music, the feeling of conversing with them, say with phrases that get repeated in different instruments, is much more visceral as well. Composer-performers will also have experienced the difference between chamber music, where everybody can expect at least some time in the foreground, and orchestral music, where a tuba player can't expect to play an important line as often as, say, the first violins. Still, another advantage of composers who can play well themselves is a deeper understanding of existing repertoire. It's often struck me that although some composition teachers, not me, look down on, for example, Rachmaninoff as old-fashioned, any pianist-composer who has played Rachmaninoff's music can't but have a healthy respect for how expressive it is and how deeply Rachmaninoff understood writing for the piano. Once you've played a piece and seriously practiced it and studied it for a while, you will see things that no analysis can bring out. I have no problem with composers analyzing music, as long as it's not just done mechanically. But when you've experienced the music yourself for weeks or even months, you can't help but experience it in a much deeper way. Analysis is a passive activity looking at something that already exists. Performing music is active. You have to decide which lines to bring out, how to phrase them, what's foreground and what's background, where are the important moments of the music that need to be emphasized, and so on. Not to mention needing to plan the actual physical choreography required to achieve the desired musical result. Finally, a beginning composer who plays an instrument can also more easily arrange to perform their own music. For example, a pianist composer who's already playing with other musicians will find them much more open to playing a new piece together, whereas someone who has no other contact with the performer just seems to be asking them a favor. So I would encourage aspiring composers to be well-rounded musicians whenever possible. Compose, but whenever possible, play music that you love yourself. If you don't play an instrument, take every opportunity you can to learn from the performers. Attend rehearsals. Observe what the performers find difficult and why. Read scores, paying attention to the individual parts, and observe the best idiomatic writing for each instrument. If you have to write an important solo part, look at etudes for that instrument at various levels of difficulty. An instrument is a tool for musical expression, and to use it well, you have to know it intimately.